Okay. Dead and Buried voiceover narration written March 2024. It is Sunday, September 1st, 3:05 p.m. I'm just going to read what I got. This process, baby. It was a dark and stormy night. No, that's not really how this story began. What was that inflection? It was a dark and stormy night. No, that's not really how this story began. But when I talk about my fascination with cemeteries, people's minds often jump to horror. I'm more interested in the poetics of death and memorialization. In 2013, I sought to make a documentary about the cemeteries of Richmond, Virginia. During college, I made a documentary about Edgar Allan Poe's life in Virginia and his influence upon its modern art and culture. This project led me to poking around cemeteries where Poe's relatives and associates were buried. A boss tipped me off to these connections. The ghost tour company I worked for hired to perform an historical play at Shockoe Hill Cemetery. The site's lack of care stirred my heart. I knew I wanted to write about these headstones, mausoleums, and graveyards. So I wrote a book proposal on Richmond cemeteries. It was accepted. At my day job, I coincidentally found myself working on a documentary about Arlington National Cemetery. Too much happened at once. Though accomplished, I was young, very young. I became overwhelmed. I took on a co-author for the book. I moved from one part of the state to another. I started a new job at a magazine. All the while, I grew impatient. I didn't really want to live in Virginia anymore. Don't know what all this stuff on my desk is. Moving it. It's not my desk, it's my boyfriend's desk, if I'm being real. All my life, I had longed for New York City. But at that point, I didn't have enough money to move to such an expensive place. Besides, I had a contract with my publisher. I had to submit the manuscript. My co-author and I would meet our deadline, no matter what it took. After I submitted the book, I got engaged. I moved back to Northern Virginia to live with my fiancé. The book was published. Sales were strong. It came to light that my co-author had plagiarized her portion of the book. It was also rife with errors. Trusting her, I had never questioned my co-author's writing. Truthfully, I hadn't done thorough enough of a background check on her. She contributed to Quail Bell Magazine, the arts and culture publication I founded in college. Her ghost stories and history articles were popular. For me, at that time, that was enough. Though I was mortified, I was too timid to publicly out her. I quietly rewrote her sections and submitted them to the publisher. A second edition of the book was already scheduled due to the book's popularity. The publisher issued a simple note about corrections in the new edition of the book. The co-author retained her byline. The publisher said the book had already been registered with the Library of Congress. That meant that the co-author's name was permanently attached to the book. I didn't argue. I was too exhausted. By that point, I had already recorded my sister's voiceover narration of my documentary. She had used the first edition of the book as a script. A rough cut of the film had been publicly screened when I found out about my co-author's plagiarism. With the book drama, I lost all momentum on the documentary. I abandoned the project. I wanted everyone else to forget about it too. I justified the decision by looking at all of my completed projects. Over the years, that body of work grew into books, paintings, films, plays, and more. Though proud of my other works, I always felt secretly ashamed of not finishing the documentary on Richmond cemeteries. I hate any time anyone mentioned the documentary or even the book. I pride myself on finishing what I started. It set me apart from my former classmates. It even set me apart from older collaborators I met as a college student. One film I starred in, helmed by a director 20 years my senior, still wasn't finished 2 years into shooting. He had already been working on it for years by the time I got involved. The other actresses were also college girls or young waitresses. Somehow he had convinced us all, should be all of us, right? Awkward, convince all of us. He had convinced all of us to go on, somehow he had convinced all of us to go on long solo filming sojourns with him. We wandered around Richmond and its outskirts as he filmed us on his camcorder. There was nothing untoward about his behavior, only strange. He lived in a rented basement in the suburbs and delivered pizzas. He chain smokes. Wait. He chain smoked. Yep. That's what that is supposed to be. He chain smoked and admitted to smoking copious amounts of pot. Shortly before my college graduation, he showed the work in progress at a local screening. He gave me a VHS saying he'd probably never finish it. I told myself that I'd grow up and never be like Tim. I wanted to finish what I started. There was also some fear of working in my father's shadow, or at least the perception that I was. More so, it was being at odds with him. I knew that he and I had different approaches to moving images. He was a director of photography for the news and documentaries. He was a hired gun, not someone who initiated his own projects. The latter was where I thrived. I was less interested in being a technician. I wanted to be an artist and filmmaker. This created tension between us. He had also gone to art school, but he warned me of practicality. He said he did what he had to do to support a family. His network experience gave him unrealistic expectations of an independent filmmaker. He had criticized me for taking as long as I had to finish the Poe documentary. When it first screened at the Poe Museum, he had no compliments for it. There must have been some kind of pride, though, because he asked about the film's progress. There, what I mean is film circuit, right? Like film festival circuit. He came to, another typo. He came to a screening at Blue Stockings Books in New York. He came to a screening of the film at Blue Stockings Books in New York. I thought that maybe asking him to film my Richmond Cemeteries documentary might flatter him. It did. He said yes, but then anytime I asked him to go on a shoot, he had an excuse. My mother dominated his free time. That dynamic had persisted my whole life. So I opted for 2 videographers my own age. Even when I moved to New York City, I saw how rare my sort of follow-through was. When I started my MFA, I was astounded by all of the incomplete projects. Some artists never seemed to move past the pitch or proposal stage. In becoming more confident, I maybe became a bit arrogant too. My efficiency alienated peers. Even ones who admired me did not necessarily want to be my friend. Some of that efficiency was driven by my husband's frustration and disappointment in me. He didn't understand why I was so particular about jobs. He didn't understand why I preferred contract and freelance work. He thought I was flighty. He urged me to be satisfied with my accomplishments and stop comparing myself to others. You've outdone everyone you went to school with. I did not necessarily agree. Besides, I wasn't so much viewing it as competition with others. As I was competition with myself. Dissatisfaction remained. For every project I completed, the guilt of that unfinished... I can feel it bubbling up inside of me. Some of those old feelings. Ugh. For every project I completed, the guilt of that unfinished documentary lingered. All hope that I would ever finish it died. I put Richmond behind me. Maybe my scope had been too provincial, I told myself. I was a New York City artist now, and New York City was a city of the world. I now made work for an audience well outside of Virginia. Even the Arlington National Cemetery documentary I worked on as an associate producer sort of embarrassed me. I hadn't been around for the film's editing process, so I only saw it once it became publicly available. It was completed around the time my auteur Richmond Cemetery's film should have been done. The take was informational, the style dry. It was a 1-hour PBS special with no grit. National distribution, but no soul. The only emotion present was patriotism. And even though the cemetery was a national one, I felt its old-fashioned Virginian approach. This was a documentary that praised honor and duty. Meanwhile, my vision for... I have 9 pages here. There's no way I'm reading all of this. I'm looking at so much of this now, and I see is just stream of consciousness. Yeah, most of this is not usable. Although I guess this is just a process film or video essay, to try en français. Okay, just another paragraph or so. Meanwhile, my vision for a documentary on cemeteries was to show decay and disrespect, tension, conflict, a subversion of expectation. In Richmond cemeteries, I saw that the othering of black bodies persisted in death. Honoring the Confederacy went unquestioned, despite Richmond remaining racially segregated. Not legally and systematically, but socially. Descendants of slaves did not typically live in the same parts of town as descendants of overseers. Even in death, there was no justice for the poor. Pauper cemeteries became overgrown. Without loved ones to pump money into the upkeep of their graves, nobody cared. They were just as marginalized in the afterlife as they had been during death. Life. They were just as marginalized in the afterlife as they had been during life. These were ugly truths that conflict with the funeral home marketing and sales packages. I visited one black cemetery with a defaced mausoleum. Someone had broken in and gotten to the skeletal remains themselves. Bones were on the floor. I don't know that I'll keep reading out loud. I'm just gonna skim. No, let's end it there. With bones were on the floor.